Welcome to New Atlas Live. I'm Brian Berletic. Joining me today is Scott from Kalibrated. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks for having me.
It's always great to have you. And as we usually do, we'll be talking about the situation in Ukraine. We are now in the third month of Ukraine's offensive. And as I pointed out, and as you've been pointing out, Scott, even the Western media is starting to admit that the offensive is going very poorly. There's still some people holding out, people who still think there might be some sort of breakthrough or some last-minute miracle. From what you've been keeping track of, how does it look to you at this point?
For the Ukrainians, not good. The situation in the counteroffensive, the way it's looking right now, we may be coming up on some slight Ukrainian tactical victories. Klishchivka has been on the edge of falling for about a month. On the ledge in between Zaporozhye and Donetsk, the Ukrainians are having some tactical success. And then possibly around Robotny, the Ukrainians are also having success, just minor success, though. I'd like to really clarify this. These successes are 70 days, just kilometers from their starting positions. So this is not how the offensive was expected to go. They haven't even really made it through even the security zone to the first line of defense. Things are going really good for the Russians. And anything you're seeing right now in terms of Ukrainian success is more propaganda than actual success. They are way behind schedule. They've lost way too many men, way too much material. And all of this is just kind of trying to keep the hopes alive that this offensive will end up being successful in one way or the other.
I think that's a really good way of putting it. And one of the news stories, or one of the themes in the news that we'll keep seeing that kind of gives people hope when everything else is going so badly for Ukraine on the battlefield, are these drone attacks that we keep seeing. This is from The Guardian, and I heard Alexander Mikuras from the Duran talking about this. Kiev's drone strikes on Moscow mean Kremlin's war can't be ignored by Russians. But if you actually read through this whole article, what do they conclude? They conclude that Russians are very well aware of the war because of the drone strikes, and all this does is make them double down on the side of the Russian government. What do you think about these drone strikes, Scott? Not just the ones in Moscow, but also the naval drones that have damaged at least 2 ships in the last 2 or 3 weeks?
Yeah, so this is one of those things where I think the Ukrainians have made a big mistake. Going along with the whole Ukrainian nationalism, these drone strikes are in that same territory where you had the perfect opportunity to really turn some of the Russians, the more pragmatic Russians in Russia that aren't, the hardliners. They don't necessarily want a conflict. They don't think Ukraine is that bad, or, whatever. You could have really turned them against the Russian government. You could have used them to win your war against Russia. They specifically, a lot of the Russophobia, these drone strikes, literally just terrorist actions. Daria Dugina, the cafe in St. Petersburg, where the Ukrainians are intentionally going after, reporters and people like that, not really military targets. It just makes you seem like less of a victim. I think that's a major mistake. They could have really rode the moral high ground and convinced a lot of people in the world that they were the victim of the situation. And instead now they're acting out. And I believe that they're acting out in these terrorist actions on Moscow. And you can consider it dual use in the Black Sea, the shipping lanes and stuff that are being interrupted by Ukrainian drones. But still, it's just they're using these as a distraction to pull away from the battlefield. But that distraction has consequences, and that consequence will end up being reverberated on the battlefield. So I don't think that they're going to achieve what the Ukrainians hope that they're going to achieve. I actually think that they aid Putin in his narrative of the war. Everybody's going to start, buying in more and more to that idea as they watch random drone strikes fly into buildings in Moscow. It's just not how you win hearts and minds.
Absolutely, and that's what it says in that article. They admit, and they're citing Western analysts and experts, and they're saying that these drone strikes have no strategic or even tactical purpose. They're just, like you say, they're just randomly crashing into buildings, and all they do is harden the Russian public against Ukraine. And so it's very self-defeating. And you would do something like that, I would say, if you were increasingly desperate. Now, this is something you just talked about, Scott. Ukraine makes, this is the New York Times, this is like just half an hour ago, Ukraine makes tactically significant progress in its counteroffensive. And they're talking about advances of between 10 to 12 miles. But also the New York Times, again, I'm going to just keep bringing this up. This was from last year, December. And let's go down to the maps. They're talking about these layered defenses, Popasnia and Kherson. The diagrams again and the maps. This is between Bakhmut and Popasnia. So if they're making progress around Bakhmut, it means they haven't even started yet. They still have to go all the way past Bakhmut, and then they'll hit the very first of several layered defenses in the direction toward Popasnia. And then again, this was December. Since December last year, they made many more layers of defenses. This is between Crimea and just Melitopol. Not even talking about between Melitopol and, say, Tokmak. Yeah. Maybe you can explain to people, okay, they're making these tactical advances. They might have some sort of semblance of success, but what does it actually mean? They're only going to be getting up to the first of several layers of defenses.
Yeah, well, I mean, that first article you put up, tactical successes, it's got to be one of the funniest terms that you can use when you're talking about a strategic offensive. Tactical successes are something that occur during more passive times. Russians have a lot of tactical successes around the front. They gain a few hundred meters here or there. They improve their position on a hilltop, something like that. That's what you would consider a tactical success. A tactical success does not usually lead to strategic successes unless there are multiple tactical successes all piled up on top of each other. We're just not seeing that from the Ukrainians. So the idea of, to call it successes is kind of reaching even in and of itself. When you're losing thousands of men, if you look around Robotny, it's been one of the harshest areas for the Ukrainians. They are just hitting a wall there. They still have not captured this basically nothing settlement. It's another farm village in Zaporozhye, and it's right near their launch point on their offensive. So to call that even a tactical success, if they even captured Robotny, would be, I think, a wild overstatement. And once you get past these first towns, which the Ukrainians are having immense time overcoming, they're going to run into more minefields, more fortifications, dragon's teeth, trench, anti-tank trenches, just things that they haven't even had to deal with, and they're not making progress. They've ran into fortifications, but nothing like what's even deeper. They haven't run into the actual Russian fire bags that are, designed to bog down the Ukrainian offensive. I think the Russians really operated correctly throughout this counteroffensive, where they did the exact opposite of what the Ukrainians expected them to do. They actually stood and fought. And that was not, it doesn't look like anybody in the West or in Ukraine had intended for that to happen, or planned for that to happen. So when it happened, the Ukrainians just continue to hit this wall. They're getting bogged down before they even get started, and they're not getting the momentum that they needed to really capitalize on any of these tactical successes.
And what's funny about this New York Times article, not funny, but yeah, they're talking about these minor tactical successes for Ukraine. They also mentioned that Russia has an ongoing offensive of its own, and yep. They mentioned Kupiansk. Maybe you could tell people about that. I know you've been following that quite closely.
Yeah, so this is actually shrouded in a little bit of mystery. We don't get a lot of information from this area. There's not as many war reporting individuals coming out of this area, and not just like War Gonzo and those guys, but even resources on the ground. On the Zaporozhye front, we get daily updates about what's happening around Robotny, what's happening on the ledge, what's happening all over the place, Kherson. You get like 24/7 updates. But up in the north in the LPR, where the Russians are on the offensive, and in the Kharkov region around Kupiansk, we have a lot less video evidence, a lot less even communication evidence of this. But the Russians are on the offensive here. They are taking multiple strong points around Kupiansk, and they're putting a lot of pressure on Kupiansk, which is a supply road for everything. Basically 1/3 of the bridgehead east of the Oskal River. Once that logistics line is cut, the Russians will have a much easier time applying pressure to Kupiansk as well as the rest of the bridgehead, and I believe that they will eventually sweep down the east side of the Oskal. I think that is the goal of this offensive, but the Russians are moving very slow and very carefully, as I think what the doctrine is now for the Russians on the offensive. They won't be moving fast anytime soon. I don't see them risking those casualties unnecessarily like the Ukrainians are in Zaporozhye.
Yeah, and Kupiansk was one of these places that Ukraine took back during their offensive last year in the fall. And I said then that they were expending huge amounts of men and machines to do their offensive in Kharkov and also Kherson, and that it was self-defeating because it's a war of attrition, and you are trading your army, your men, and your equipment for territory, when this is about who's going to have the most men and equipment on the battlefield the longest. And so now we're actually seeing that territory change hands again, back in favor of Russia. So it's undoing the offensive of last year, while Russia is also stopping the offensive ongoing this year.
Yeah.
Let's see what else. And also these tactical successes, say in the South. I was listening to Michael Kaufman. He's one of these think tank experts. He's in one of these U.S. government and industry-funded think tanks, and he was talking about how they had two cores. The first core was supposed to break through. The second core was supposed to exploit that. You now have this core that was supposed to exploit the breakthrough. They're now the ones trying to make the breakthrough, and we're in the third month of fighting. So. How much more do you think, this is speculation obviously, but how much more do you think Ukraine has left in order to continue this? This is not something that they have infinite time to do.
Yeah, and I just would like to, remind people that there are two different axes that the Ukrainians are pushing on. They are pushing in Bakhmut, and they are also pushing in Zaporozhye in two different sections. So you have basically three-ish kind of offensives going on, and the Ukrainians are suffering heavily on all of these. Hold on just a second. So you have the Bakhmut area where the Ukrainians were pushing incredibly hard. I thought this was actually where they were going to have the most success, because this is where the Russian lines are the newest. The Russians had just captured Bakhmut. So the Ukrainians pushing here makes more sense around Klishchivka. There's just not the fortifications necessary to defend against massive, infantry attacks and armored vehicle attacks. The Russians have actually done very well in this area, continuing to hold back the Ukrainians. And with this push in the LPR, the activity around Bakhmut has diminished significantly. I think that they had to pull reserves and rotate reserves up into the LPR and Kharkov, which could actually have been the purpose of these pushes, especially the one that crossed the Zhibyets River and they control the bridgehead still. I think that was primarily a distraction to pull reserves away from the ongoing counteroffensive around Bakhmut, which it did. We haven't seen any progress around Bakhmut for the Ukrainians in about 3 weeks. But in terms of how long they can continue going, like you said, the first core hit a wall. It didn't do what it was supposed to do. What do you have to exploit a breakthrough? It feels like you're now wasting what you have in the hopes of achieving a goal that has already been corrupted by the loss of this first core. You're never going to get another core to break through whatever the 10th core, which is the actual breakthrough core that's being used as, the primary core now. it's not going to work out. So I think that there will be one last big push to try to gain some sort of victory that they can present to their audience. I don't know where it will be. Rabitny is like the area that they need to go in, because that's the straight shot to Tokmak and then Melitopol and then down to Crimea. That was like the primary objective. That seems impossible now. It does not seem likely in the slightest. So I think that they have, like I said, one big push before the mud arrives and things slow down. And I would, from a military strategy standpoint, I would say don't do it. Hold those cards. It'll make you stronger at the negotiating table if that's your plan. If your plan is just, doubling down and going for it and not keeping anything in reserve, then that's the choice you're going to make. But it doesn't feel like they're going to have any major success anywhere, anything worth the manpower and material that they will lose for it. And with this Russian push in the north, if it's not contained soon, Ukrainian sources are even talking about how bad it is. They are suffering huge losses. They are outgunned in this area by the Russians because everything is being focused in Zaporozhye and around Bakhmut. There's not a lot of EW up there, electronic warfare, for those who don't know. For the Ukrainians, not as much air defense. Glide bombs are landing on Kupiansk every day. The pressure is just so immense that if something doesn't change in this area, the Russians are going to really have the most gain throughout the summer offensive, which was supposed to be a Ukrainian offensive.
Yes, and I see somebody commented about these F-16s, because I still hear people holding out. They said if we just get the F-16s and the ATACMS, we could win the offensive, and then we could win the war as well. And I think people do not grasp how impossible this is. This is so implausible. F-16s are never going to be a factor in this conflict. And now they're even admitting openly that these F-16s, the training isn't even going to start until they pass some sort of English program. And even then it's six pilots, something like that. And so not until sometime next year. And a lot can happen between now and next year. And as far as the ATACMS go, again, if any of these were war-winning capabilities, Russia would have won already because they have more of all of this. Yes. Now, Scott, you follow a lot of what's going on Telegram. I actually follow your Telegram channel to filter through, because there's so many resources out there. What about the actual fighting on the ground? What type of tactics or weapon systems do you see being utilized? How are things changing over the course of the offensive?
For the Ukrainians?
For either side, Ukrainian or Russian.
Yeah, so for the Ukrainians, they started with an armored push. That was the beginning when we saw the Leopard pile up. We saw the demining vehicles stopped in the fields. That's how they started. One thing that Zaluzhny is known for is constantly rotating tactics. If something's not working, he changes it. He doesn't continue doing the same thing over and over again, hoping for different results. The definition of insanity. So he's at least got that right. And they moved to more of a mosquito sort of swarm tactic, where it's a lot more infantry, a lot more light vehicles moving quickly across open territory, which is great. And it achieved some minor tactical success again. But what's missing when you don't have armor is protection for infantry. And the infantry losses skyrocketed over basically, there was that 2 weeks in June, and then from mid to late June to like mid-July, the Ukrainian infantry casualties went up like immensely. So one thing Ukraine does not have a lot of is well-trained, combat effective manpower. This is something that they've struggled with, and even what they're using has kind of shown that it's not who they're using, I guess, rather, has shown that they're not really capable, which is this NATO-trained army. They were all green. They weren't like reserves that were sent away to Europe to get trained. These were guys that had no military experience, picked up off the streets, sent to NATO countries. They trained for 3 months, and then they were sent back. And there's just not the experience. There's not the cohesion. this offensive was really up against the wall from the beginning. So when you're talking about tactics from the Ukrainians, I think they're just trying everything that they can to succeed. We're seeing a lot more, kind of asymmetrical stuff with, bridge strikes that don't really matter. It's a lot of like propaganda stuff. It's really seeming like this offensive is going nowhere, and the command knows it, and they're starting to do. They're starting to exercise force in other directions, like with hitting the shipping lanes, the Russian SIG ship that was transporting oil to Syria. That has nothing to do with this conflict. It has nothing at all to do with the conflict. The only thing that I can see that achieves is trying to force the Russians to rejoin the grain deal, which benefits the EU. And by doing that, Ukraine is serving some sort of purpose, because right now in their counteroffensive, they're not doing what they need to do. Support is going to slowly start fading, and they have to do something. So that is a slight change of tactics. I would say it's a distraction, but it also serves some larger purpose in terms of support. But yeah, it's not looking good. Everything that they're trying seems to be, succeeding temporarily, but then the Russians adapt. And I think that is the big change in tactic that the Russians have made, is they are adapting so much quicker on the battlefield. This is not the army that went in 2022. This is a sharp new army that is using technology to its advantage. Every time we see a Ukrainian attack, we see it from 3 different drone angles. The drone warfare for Russia has basically peaked. It is incredible now. The only thing they're missing is heavy strike drones, which I'm sure are on the way. They're trying to produce those, but that, I would say, that is the major tactic that has changed for the Russians, and they are using it to their advantage. They're also using a lot less artillery, because they are using these drones to more accurately call in artillery. So the Russians are just getting leaner and meaner, while the Ukrainians are, attriting. Basically, they just don't have the replenishment. They don't have the weapon systems to really even be changing tactics on the battlefield in a significant and meaningful way.
Yeah, and something I want to remind people of is that Russia created these defenses in layers for a very good reason. They are fully prepared to fall back to positions further behind the lines. This is meant to absorb any heavy Ukrainian pushes. So when the New York Times or these people on Twitter, these so-called experts, talk about these successes, this is just Russia using their layered defenses the way they were meant to be used, to absorb any sort of powerful strike by or assault by Ukraine. They'll do counterattacks to get that territory back, just so that they could use it to absorb the next attack without even having to fall back. But even if they do fall back to layers further behind the lines, this is exactly why they made these layered defenses in the first place. I have someone here asking, is there a Russian winter offensive? Scott, you want to answer that one first, and then I'll say what I think.
So I think in a couple months here, probably September time, you will see the Russians begin another infrastructure campaign against the Ukrainians. From some of the reports I've been hearing, the Ukrainian infrastructure barely made it through this very mild winter. The Russians weren't particularly aggressive against power plants. They hit one in Kryvyi Rog, one in Kiev, and maybe 2 more, one in Kharkov, and then one more somewhere else, which is not the totality of Ukrainian power infrastructure. If they would have gone after every plant in the country, there wouldn't be any power to the country right now. They mostly targeted smaller substations that had to do with rail infrastructure that were actually dual use. I think the Russians were really sticking to that sort of, not trying to harm the civilian population, but trying to stop the military. Now, I don't know if that's going to occur. I think that the Russians are going to be more aggressive in this winter campaign, and I think that the Ukrainian infrastructure, the Ukrainian grid, won't be able to hold up. If that happens, I believe that you will see a Russian offensive if the timings work out. I don't know what the goal is for mobilization. I don't know how many reserves the Russians have, ready to go. I don't know what the attrition has been. So that is a variable that you have to add in. The Russians are very careful and very particular about where they go on the offensive and how hard they go on the offensive now. So, you could see nothing throughout the winter and just see a continued attrition of Ukrainian forces until there's literally nothing left. And then the Russians will go. I do think that from a geopolitical standpoint, a strong Russian offensive this winter would be one of the best things that they could do. If they made some big gains, achieved a lot of success, I think that would put the West on the back foot, and it would really create the conditions for negotiations in Ukraine. If Russia continues to go slow, I think the West may identify that as weakness and continue doing what they're doing, continue supplying weapons, continue training men, and continue financing this war. I think the U.S. just asked for an extra $24 billion in financial support for Ukraine, which is, just another $24 billion out the window, gone. Taxpayer money, bye.
Yes, and people have to remember the U.S. isn't going to run out of money. This is something else Alexander Mikuros was talking about in one of his recent videos. You're not going to run out of money. What you are going to run out of, however, are things to buy with that money, because the Western military industrial outputs just simply cannot keep up. Now, I hear this often, and I think it's a legitimate point that people bring up. I hear this all the time. Russia has superiority in numbers, air, artillery, ammunition, experience, preparedness in defense. When are they going on the attack? And this is what last winter, everyone said there was going to be a Russian offensive, and there wasn't. And Russia never said that they were going on the offensive. And when you actually really think about it, if they go on the offensive, they will have the same problems Ukraine has. You send your troops forward. They're out in the open. They're exposed. They're going to fall. They're going to fall over landmines. They're going to be hit by artillery. They're going to be out in the open. They will lose large numbers of men and machines. And Russia has the numbers to do this, but they don't want to lose men and machines for this to be successful. Ukraine doesn't have the numbers for it to be successful. So they're just losing huge numbers of men and machines, and they're not even successful at it. So what Russia has been doing, and as you were just mentioning, they do this grinding, attritional warfare. They do sort of do an offensive where they are gaining ground, but they're just doing it very slowly. It's not these big arrow offensives that a lot of people continuously predict. So I think I agree with that. I also agree with the idea of them hitting infrastructure, whatever the reason was, whether it was to exhaust their air defenses or a number of objectives. I think it's very likely they'll start that again.
The last time they did it was because of the Kerch Bridge, right? That's what Putin said. That was at least his excuse for doing it. I really think that was probably planned from the beginning. It's kind of how you fight wars. So, going after infrastructure is not something new. It's dual use. It's what the U.S. has done in every invasion that they've ever been a part of. So, I think it was kind of planned, but definitely Ukraine gave them the excuse. And what excuse does he have this time? He has another Kerch Bridge hit. He has drones on Moscow, and he has civilian shipping, right? So he has the cards are in his in his hand. He's winning right now, and he can do whatever he needs to do.
Yes. The next thing that a lot of people constantly ask, and I really don't have an answer for this, but what are the losses? What are the losses overall since this fighting began in 2022 for Russia and for Ukraine? And I have this up on the screen. This is Media Zona, and together with the BBC, they were doing a count. They were trying to confirm the number of deaths of Russian service members. And their number right now, since February 2022 up until now, is 30,000. What do you think about that number, Scott? And what do you think the number is for Ukraine?
Yeah, so 30,000 is probably going to be slightly lower than what the Russians' actual number is, just because these are all social media and obituary confirmed losses. I would say 40,000 is a realistic number for the Russians in terms of KIA, which is over a year and a half time span. You're probably looking at another 60 to 100,000 wounded. To varying degrees, whether they return or not is up for debate. So I would probably put Russian total casualties and in terms of not returning to combat at around 100,000, where Ukrainian losses are a little bit more difficult to pinpoint. They like to keep those numbers very close to the chest. We heard the head of the EU, Ursula von der Leyen, say 100,000 Ukrainian servicemen had died. That was almost a year ago. And those numbers, I believe, were delayed at that time, even so, and probably, dampened down from what they actually are. A realistic number, I would say 150 to 200,000 KIA. I think that is realistic for this conflict. But in terms of the wounded, it is much, much higher just because of how artillery heavy this war is. The number of lost limbs, the number of people not returning because of shrapnel wounds is going to be immense. So, I would probably say the casualties are somewhere in the 400,000 range, but those are not KIA. That's total combat loss. And then, give or take 10, 20, 30,000 either way, just because who knows. But I think that is a realistic number especially for how aggressive they have been in this counteroffensive and how high their losses have been. If you believe the Russian MOD numbers, they're getting close to 50,000 men lost for this offensive so far. If you don't believe the MOD numbers, I would probably put it closer to 30,000 KIA over the three different, I guess you could say four if you include the Kherson bridgehead area, axis of advance. And it's not looking good. Either any way you put it, the Ukrainians have suffered immensely for this, and the saying to the last Ukrainian is really starting to become reality, and it's unfortunate.
Yes, and actually, I have found that the Russian Ministry of Defense numbers for both Ukrainian losses and Russian losses have been more or less on the money. That media zona number of 30,000, they did that. They've been announcing this for maybe the last year or so, every couple of months. And there was one point where Russia gave their last number of Russian losses, and it matched. It was very close. It was much closer than these claims we hear out of Ukraine general staff and their claims of Russian losses. So there's that. And I've noticed, and I don't know if you've noticed this, Scott, I've been reading the Western media, their assessment of the offensive and how it's been going very badly. Articles like this from Vox, and they admit that the losses for Ukraine are catastrophic in terms of manpower and equipment. So what do you say to these people out there who have huge followings and people in the public place their trust in, who say, no, Ukraine isn't losing, they're not losing anyone, their vehicles are all fine, everything is great, they didn't even get started with this offensive? I mean, how do you respond to people like that? How do you get through to people who buy into that?
Well, it's difficult because people are very, very constrained to their bias. So if you say something, especially people who are in echo chambers, if you try to talk to them about what's going on, what the reality is, it usually hardens their position. If they hear something that they don't like, they recede into their shells and then they'll just hold fast. I would usually, the way I would intellectually approach this is I would say, look at a map. Look at a map. What were the Ukrainians saying? What were the West saying a couple months ago? I just saw a tweet by Ben Hodges, General Ben Hodges, that was talking about Crimea being isolated now at the end of summer. And if you remember what he had said before the summer began, was that Crimea was likely going to be the Ukrainians were likely going to be at the gates of Crimea by the end of summer. We're here, and the Ukrainians haven't made it 3 kilometers deep anywhere on the front. So that would be the first thing I would say, is just look at a map. Does this look like success to you? If this looks like success, then you're lost. I mean, I can't help you. The second thing I would say is look at how the Western media is now turning on the Ukrainians. These have been their most solid backers this entire conflict. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, all of these different news outlets, mainstream media outlets, have been so pro-Ukrainian to the point of, Ghost of Kiev, Snake Island, all of the propaganda stuff that everybody who actually followed the conflict immediately, said that's not true, that's not real, it's just nonsense. They are now turning on the Ukrainian narrative. I think that this is very, very, very telling of what's going on. I think that they are preparing their audience for what's coming. And that would be the second way I would do it. The third way I would approach that would be visual evidence. This is something that the Russians have done a much better job of since the counteroffensive started. They have always been so poor at narrative control, information space management, all of that. They just don't seem to care. It's not important to them. They're fighting a war. That's what they're doing. Because they don't, in Russia, they don't need to really maintain public opinion because they already have public support. In the West, you have, especially in the United States, and I think this is something that's going to be coming into effect here soon, is we have pretty competitive elections where the opponents of the people running or the people in office will use every single little thing they can against whoever's in charge. So for Biden right now, asking for 24 billion, that's going to come up in a debate. Why are we sending this money here? What's being achieved? Is Ukraine winning? Is the Ukraine project going in the right direction that it was intended to go in? Is Russia becoming weaker or stronger through this? And when you start asking those questions, that whole idea that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is going well, it collapses in on itself. This thing is going horribly, and even worse than somebody like me who didn't think it was going to go well at all thought. I thought that the Ukrainians would at least make it to Tokmak. I said for the first 2 weeks the Russians were going to look like a punching bag, and it was the exact opposite. The Ukrainians looked like the punching bag out in an open field. It's gone horribly. There's no way around it. There's no other way to describe it. Could it change? Potentially, but the Russians don't seem to be backing up hardly at all anywhere. They seem steadfast. There's no equipment shortages on the field that I can see. Artillery usage has remained consistent, whereas the Ukrainians has now dropped because they just don't have the ammunition readily available. So yeah, things are not going good. And when you're trying to convince somebody, all you can do is present evidence, and if they won't hear it, then there's no talking to them.
Yes. Did you get a chance to read this, Scott, or not yet?
I read the first couple paragraphs, I think.
So this is from the Times. Ukraine is winning the war with Russia, but it won't be over by Christmas. But then when you actually read through it, they're not actually describing Ukraine winning anything at all that I can tell. They do, however, repeat some of these myths that I think we've both tried to address over the last couple of weeks. This idea that somehow Ukraine is outfighting Russia in terms of artillery. They don't have more artillery pieces. They don't have more artillery ammunition, but somehow they're outfighting Russia through artillery. And I just don't think that is true. I don't see anything at all to. What is your take on that? I've already explained in a previous video why I think that this is a myth. What is your take on that?
So at the beginning of the conflict, this may have been more substantiated, just in the way that the Ukrainians were using drones more effectively. They may have had Western systems that were slightly more accurate. There's always that argument that Ukrainians can drop a shell on top of the Russians, where the Russians will have to fire 30 shells to maybe get close. That has definitely changed. I mean, if anybody's watching any of the footage coming out of this counteroffensive, Russian artillery is spot on. They're literally hitting vehicles in open fields. Also, Russian artillery has greatly advanced in their guided munitions, their artillery rounds that are, GPS guided. That has increased tenfold. And the Russians don't even have to rely on artillery as much anymore because they have FPV drones and Lancets that have been absolutely tearing this counteroffensive apart. So, if anybody's saying that Ukrainian artillery is operating more effectively or at greater numbers, which it absolutely isn't, it's just a falsehood. We don't see it anywhere. We do see actually the Ukrainians using HIMARS to take out things like Grad missile launchers and stuff like that, multiple launch rocket systems, which is not an effective use of a HIMARS missile. But Russian air defense has become so strong against HIMARS that they are now forced to use these weapons on soft targets. And, that is another bad sign. You don't want to be using $100,000 rockets on, trucks, basically. It's what a Grad is. So, I think that's sort of where this whole artillery war idea has come from. But I think the idea that the Ukrainians are attriting the Russians and they are winning an artillery war while on the offensive outside of their cover, it doesn't make any logical sense. It doesn't make any sense in reality. So, yeah, no, I don't. There's nowhere on the map where the Ukrainians are more effectively utilizing artillery against the Russians. I think the reason why they're saying that is because the Ukrainians aren't moving anywhere. So all the Ukrainians are actually doing is firing artillery. That's the only successes we're seeing is artillery strikes on Russian positions.
That's a good point. I was just going to say that the only videos coming out is not of Ukraine making any kind of progress, because they're not, but they are hitting things with their artillery. I mean, that is a fact. They are hitting things. They are killing Russian troops. They are destroying Russian equipment. And so this is the only evidence they have of any sort of success. Of course, there are positions that this fighting in the gray zone, there are positions Ukraine takes, but then Russia takes back. So these are these tactical vignettes that I've heard Michael Kaufman actually warn people about. You look at these tactical vignettes, don't try to extrapolate everything that you think you know about the conflict based off of these, because there's so much more to the story. And this article is actually titled "Ukraine is winning the war with Russia," but then it says mounting frustration because there's no progress at all. So you could see how they're contradicting themselves in the body of the article versus the title. And as you come down, they talk about they're probably not going to make any progress with the offensive. They need to dig in, but don't worry, because they're going to have M1 Abrams tanks and F-16s coming. So this is the wonder weapon syndrome that they have had throughout this entire conflict, and I just don't think they're going to. I don't think they're going to learn their lesson.
Do you think that these Abrams or F-16s are ever going to be in country?
If I was the U.S., I would try to delay it for as long as possible, because they're gonna burn. They're gonna burn in Ukraine. So how's that going to look for?
We still haven't seen Challengers or Strikers anywhere on the field. They're holding them in reserve, I guess. This was supposed to be part of the breakthrough, the 10th Corps, and we just haven't seen them anywhere on the battlefield. I do think that these are being that the West is telling the Ukrainians not to use these weapon systems.
You haven't seen any Strikers, because I think I haven't seen any Strikers in any of these videos myself personally, but the U.S. did send additional ones that were supposedly replacements. Now, again, Alexander Mikuras was talking about how they're very temperamental, and even when training, they were probably breaking them and they needed replacements. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, they only had like 24 Challengers, so I expect those to sit in Western Ukraine for the foreseeable future on the training grounds where they are always filmed. The Strikers, there's been some like very blurry,
possible sightings, some
possible hits, but also they look the same as BMPs. So from the sky, it's a 8-wheeled vehicle that has a gun on top. It's kind of hard to identify them. But we haven't seen them used in any significant way like Bradley's or Leo's. So they're somewhere. My guess is that we'll end up probably seeing them up in the north if the Russians start making serious breakthroughs. That armored division or corps, whatever, that armored group is going to be sent up there to stop that breakthrough. Just like we saw with the Swedish CV90s.
Yes, I was just going to mention them.
Yeah,
yes.
The Bradley copy. We've seen those up in the north, which, you don't really want to be using your best equipment to defend against a Russian push when you're on the offensive.
Yes, and those CV90s have been found and destroyed by all different types of Russian.
They already have one in Moscow, so.
Yes. Yeah. So again, all of these Western weapons, as it turns out, they not as advertised.
No.
Let's see, what else do we have? Is there anything, Scott, that you specifically want to cover that I haven't brought up yet?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on how you think the West saw the Ukrainian offensive going, because I made a tweet about this yesterday, and I've been thinking about this a lot. It seemed to me, I'm just going to lay it out timeline-wise, that the West wanted the Ukrainians to go on the offensive in the spring. The Ukrainians weren't ready. They weren't ready in the summer when they started. So it was delayed till the summer. It was very telegraphed, but I believe the West thought that the Russians were going to turn tail, like they did in Kharkov, like they did in Kherson. They just really bought into this idea that the Russians were not going to fight, because whether it's morale or whatever it is, they just assumed that was the assumption, was that the Russians were going to, get out of there. So from June 4th, when the operation started, you had the dam blown. You had all, this massive push to Rabitny, where we saw the pileups. There was no breakthrough. And then from June 4th to June 11th, I think that the West was expecting massive Ukrainian gains. And that's what they were going to present at Vilnius in Lithuania at the NATO summit. That didn't end up happening. And so that NATO summit was very neutered. Nothing happened. It was a big nothing burger. Everybody was expecting some, security guarantees, something to do with NATO, something, talking in that direction. Didn't happen. And then over the next, 2 months, the Ukrainians were supposed to complete their operation to the Sea of Azov, come up to Crimea, and from that position, the negotiations in Saudi Arabia were to begin, and that's where they were going to come to the negotiating table and give the Russians an option. And that's why they didn't include them in this negotiation. And then once again, the Saudi Arabia thing completely collapsed. There was no progress made in any direction. Nobody could agree on territorial giving up territory. They couldn't agree to what was going to happen for the Russians or for the Ukrainians. So it just all collapsed. And now it feels like the Ukrainians have nothing else to look forward to. Do you kind of agree with that? Does that timeline make sense?
Yes, it does. And also in regards to Saudi Arabia, I think what they were going to do is try to convince Russia's allies, people who weren't really on board with the sanctions, to finally get on board with the sanctions and finally, once and for all, isolate Russia. Because, hey, look, the offensive went well and Russia is cornered. So it's not going so well, and it's just going to get worse. So you should side with us. And I believe it was all political and psychological. The whole premise of isolating Crimea by cutting the land bridge and blowing up the Crimean bridge makes no sense. It has been part of Russia since 2014. The bridge wasn't built until 2018. The land bridge wasn't established until 2022. Russia can sustain Crimea without the land bridge and also without the Crimean bridge. The whole idea that they were going to somehow cut off the Crimean Peninsula, it's ridiculous. They have boats. They have airlift. They can do that. So I agree with that. I think that was the plan. But again, how do you transfer a whole army's worth of equipment that the Ukrainians are not familiar with, aren't trained on? How do you transfer all of that over to them and get them to carry out a successful offensive that seems like it was based on what the U.S. did in Iraq, where conditions were entirely different. Everything was completely different. It was not comparable in any way. They didn't have air cover. They didn't have an advantage in terms of artillery, and they were trying to plow through minefields. It was never going to work. Everyone said it wasn't going to work, and now you see in these articles people finally talking like we have about the training. You can't train a recruit in 3 weeks or even 3 months to be effective in this type of military operation. It's impossible, and now we're seeing how impossible it is. So I think that is I think you laid that out pretty well, and I would agree. I think that's what they thought was going to happen. I don't think they thought that they were going to win or anything like that, but I think they thought it would have put Russia in a precarious position diplomatically, and they could have gotten people over on their side diplomatically to kind of push it over the edge and finally get what they wanted. And that's not happening. That's not happening now.
Not even close. Do you think that the SMO, the war in Ukraine, do you think it can come to an end via negotiations? I've heard a lot of different opinions on this. I think that I definitely think it could. There's always a possibility that it can, but I don't see the Russians coming to the negotiating table anytime soon, considering how negotiations have gone in the past, how the grain deal was operated, how, they've been led by the nose in every direction for the entirety of the from 2014 until now. So
yes.
Do you think that this ends in negotiations? It definitely is not going to the negotiating table anytime soon, in my opinion, because of this failed offensive. I'm just curious. And what do you think? Because I've heard comments from Peskov talking about, we're just trying to get these 4 oblasts secured, so on and so forth, what we've annexed. Do you think that the goals are further than that? Or, do they extend beyond what the Russians have captured? Do you think it's a more minimalist goal right now, just trying to get this done and then maybe approach that? Or do you think the goal is just these 4 oblasts and then we're going to end this and negotiate?
Well, that's a good question, and I really don't know. I think they say that this is their objective because it's something that they most certainly can achieve, but I think there probably are things beyond that they definitely need to achieve, but they haven't said it. And they kind of have alluded to it by saying, well, we want denazification, we want the demilitarization of Ukraine. So obviously they have to go much further than these oblasts to achieve that. I don't know. I don't think about negotiation as a viable option. I don't think that anything will be agreed to unless it's absolutely, any alternative is made absolutely impossible on the battlefield itself. This is very similar to the situation in Syria, the U.S. proxy war there. They're still not agreeing. They completely lost the proxy war. They're just clinging there. They froze it, and they're clinging to eastern Syria. Turkey is in the north, and now it's up to Russia, Syria, Iran to kind of pry them out, and that's what we're watching. And I think it's going to be very similar in regards to Ukraine. This is going to be a long and very difficult process. And I could picture this lasting for years, honestly. Yeah. But as I always point out, there are these other clocks that are ticking: de-dollarization, the shift from unipolarism to multipolarism. This is all ongoing. And as this takes place, it makes the position of the U.S. and their proxies more and more tenuous. So I think that's also going to play a factor into this. Let's see. Do you have anything else? Do we have any questions from the audience? If you have a question, just put capital Q or question in all caps. Ask your question, and we'll do our best to. While we're waiting for some questions, I just want to go over this. Scott Ritter had his YouTube channel deleted by reading this RT article. It looks like he was I think he was bringing on people from the Russian media or Russian media programs. He was putting it on his channel, and YouTube will delete you for that. And that is plain wrong. And I know he's a polarizing figure. Some people don't like Scott. Some people like him. But it doesn't matter. This is wrong what YouTube is doing to him, and we all need to speak up about it. I see people asking about Gonzalo Lira. The irony is Scott Ritter spent all last week, trying to convince people to doubt his story rather than speak up for his freedom. He's detained by the Ukrainian authorities. He's probably waiting trial, and he'll probably be sentenced to prison. And now Scott is here in this situation where he's asking people to advocate for his he's facing injustice. He wants people to speak up for it. I say every time there's injustice, we all have to speak up. It doesn't matter whether you like them or not. It's actually more principled to speak up for someone you don't like. So I want everyone to keep that in mind. We all have to stick together. It was Gonzalo Lira yesterday. Now it is Scott Ritter. It could be any one of us tomorrow. So let's
I was just about to say it's going to be you tomorrow and then me the next day if we don't stand up.
Or both of us at the same time, because we're both bald and they confuse us, so they just delete us both on the same day. All right, let's see if we have some questions here. Let's go with this one. How will the investment in the Ukraine project affect the U.S. strategic position in? So I think this is Asia Pacific. Will it be minor? I think it's major. Scott, why did you go ahead with that one first?
I mean, the whole world is looking at this now. I mean, China has to be eyeballing this whole situation and thinking, oh my God, this is what's going to end up happening to us. This is the same playbook they use over and over again. The goal was regime change in Russia. It has nothing to do with Ukraine. Unfortunately, Ukraine is just the tool, the means to the end. It could have been anywhere. It could have been anybody. They just happened to choose Ukraine. Ukraine was a susceptible population to propaganda and going against their pragmatic interests in the region. They used that, and now it's going to, further affect the U.S.'s position around the world. I think we're seeing that most handedly in Africa right now. The tides are turning against the West in Africa. In the Middle East, we're seeing a lot more pragmatic approach. Saudi Arabia is doing deals with China and the U.S. and Iran, getting things done. I think that's the way you're going to start to see this move. And when it comes to, the South Pacific, the U.S. does have a foothold. Brian knows all about that. He's currently living in a country where the U.S. is politically interfering. At least that's my opinion on it. I don't know if it'll affect their strategic position, but it will harshen the response from people who can see what's going on. Everybody, if you would have approached the Pacific Theater before Ukraine, there probably wouldn't have been this idea that, oh, you're going to use a population against us. You're going to, turn your propaganda machine and invest an insane amount of money to depose leaders or, regime change or whatever. So I do think it definitely affects how this is going. And these countries aren't going to want to become a Ukraine. So, there's that thinking too. I don't want to be the next proxy. I don't want to be the Kurds in Syria being forgot about. I don't want to be the Ukrainians in Ukraine getting slaughtered because they are going against their own pragmatic interests. Why wouldn't I just do deals with China and the US and not, go full bore against anybody? I think that's sort of what this question's asking, right?
Yeah, no, and I agree. Number one, what the U.S. is doing in Ukraine right now is going to disturb and wake up a lot of people in Asia who see the U.S. using them in a very similar way. The other major connection is that the U.S. is expending itself in Ukraine as part of this proxy war. What are they going to have left to use in the Pacific against China? So this is the whole story about, well, if they intervene in Ukraine and they use their air power, the U.S. and Europe use their air power, that's air power they're not going to have to use if they provoke a war with China. Scott, you were going to say something.
Yeah, and I was just going to say there's also another angle on this where you won't have the political ambition in the United States or in the West to do this again after Ukraine. If Ukraine fails and they don't achieve what they're hoping to achieve out of it, you're not going to have people on board to do it again somewhere else. There's going to be definite hesitation when it comes to that. And you're also not going to have the domestic support to go do this in another place if Ukraine fails. And if it is properly publicized that this Ukraine project has failed. Unfortunately, most of the American population, at least, is massively uneducated on anything that has to do with anything outside of their state, let alone their country. So most people don't even know what's going on in Ukraine. Most people have forgot that there's even a war happening. It's just so out of mind, especially if you don't watch mainstream media news, and you never hear about it. I do this all day, every day, on top of my other, my job and stuff like that. So when it comes to people knowing anything about what's going on, it's 0 to none. It's people have no idea what's happening. And if you can really convey and get that message out there, I think that there won't be they won't be able to use Taiwan against China or, something else of that nature in the future, because how poorly this Ukraine project has gone and how much money has been wasted.
Yeah. And let's see, there's this one here talking about the number of missiles China has. Yes, they have the largest inventory in size and quantity and variety. They also have the largest industrial capacity on Earth. No other country even comes close. So yeah, we're looking at the military industrial output and how that is a factor between the US and Russia in this proxy war in Ukraine. This is going to have an even bigger impact on any conflict the US wages with China. Let's see.
And they have their energy. I mean, the one thing that China lacks is, a constant energy provider. And now they have it in Russia. That's another failure of this Western plan in Ukraine. Was the goal should have been pull Russia as far away from China as possible, create tension there, make them not trade like they should be, as being as close to each other as they are, just like the U.S. did in the 70s, just pulled China away from Russia. That should have been the goal. Instead, now what you have is China exporting everything to Russia, everything that Russia needs. And now you have Russia exporting gas and oil to China, which is what China needs. Yeah. So that card is now out of the United States' hands. They've played that card. It doesn't exist anymore. And that's going to be difficult for them to overcome.
Yes, and I've talked to Mark Sloboda and Carl Za, and they have been on at least twice specifically talking about Chinese-Russian relations. This myth that they're tenuous friends at best, and there's some possibility of dividing them. This is actually a myth. It's not true. They have so much that they've been working together on so many different levels. The fact that the U.S. is trying to encircle and contain both of them, that's just one extra reason for them to stick closer together and help each other through this. Will the first of the 3 lines of Russian defenses ever be actually breached during this counteroffensive? I don't know. I thought that they would have. I thought that Ukraine would have made it through at least several of the layers of defense, and then the offensive would die strangled in this salient. But they haven't even got through the first one. What do you think about that, Scott?
Yeah, so if they really commit very heavily, they're not too far away in some areas. I still think that we could be looking at, 10, 20, 30 kilometers of penetration. I think that's a very realistic idea for this offensive. They could get to the second line. They could get through the second line, but the losses are going to be catastrophic. I mean, there's just, and barring a full Russian collapse, which we haven't seen anywhere, there's no sign of it anywhere. The losses from that will be, untenable. They're not going to be able to hold the land that they gain. The Russians will quickly push back. Even in the areas where the Ukrainians are pushing, we see constant Russian counterattacks. It's more like positional warfare than an actual offensive. So, if I was honestly, the odds of them actually getting through the first line are pretty, I would say pretty low now. But making it through the second line, probably not at all. And the third, I don't even think they'll ever see the third line. I don't think they're going to make it to Tokmak, Melitopol, any of those places.
Yes, but that's if what we assume about troop dispositions on both sides is true. I've
Yes.
already learned. I learned last year during the Kharkov offensive. I was so certain that Russia politically would not accept losing territory in Kharkov that I didn't imagine that would have been anything but temporary. But they simply didn't have enough troops. So understanding troop disposition is essential. And if you're not sure, then we should just we don't know.
Yeah.
That's a question we can't answer. I think Scott, are you following what's going on in Niger or not?
Yeah, a little bit. I'm just not as well-rounded as I am on Ukraine. But yes, I do. I'm following that.
Well, because we have a lot of people asking, and another thing is I haven't talked about it yet because in order for me to actually do a video just on a specific country, I have to actually go through and do all of the background research, and I haven't had time to do that yet. If it does become an actual conflict, and I hear a lot of people saying that it does look like a military intervention is gearing up. If that does happen, I will do the work, and I will, and other people who are on this and doing a very good job, obviously the Duran, Alex Christopher, Alexander McCures, Scott, you're following it. Again, not as closely as Ukraine.
But I'm posting about it. I'm just not.
Yes.
Like, I can't go into the ethnic and cultural differences within Niger because I know that there's, Islamic presence, and I just don't know all of the nitty gritty. I know what's going on. I know the countries that are planning to go in. I know the countries that are, have juntas in charge that are going to oppose that. I know where Algeria stands. I know where France stands. I know where the U.S. stands, Egypt, so on. So the African Union. I know a general knowledge of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're probably going to be talking about that again if it is a military intervention.
I don't see how that benefits Nigeria. I don't see how that benefits the West African economic cooperation, and I don't understand how that benefits the African Union. Obviously, you don't want coups happening, but if we're going to be realistic, first off, Niger is no stranger to coups. This is not something new for this region, and most African countries are not, strangers to coups. So I don't really understand the whole harshness towards this particular coup. I think it's because the dominoes are starting to fall, and I think that they're falling towards Russia and China, and the West can't really allow that to happen. I mean, France is going to get pushed out of Niger if this doesn't abate. So I hope there's no military conflict because of all the regions in the world that desperately do not need a war. It's Africa. Again, yes. West Africa is particularly a bad area. So let's hope that this doesn't happen.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think a lot of these countries thinking about being involved in some sort of intervention, I don't think that they're enthusiastic about it, but I think the US and Europe, they're going to pull every card that they have, every bit of leverage they have, they're going to use that to compel them to do so.
Yeah.
Because just like you said, these are dominoes that are following the US and Europe. They are being pushed out of Africa because they're not there to cooperate or work with anyone. They are there to conquer it or reconquer it in many cases.
And just for the audience, anybody wanting to follow the situation, I would pay particularly close attention to Chad now. Wagner has just hired on Arabic and another language that's spoken in Chad specifically, interpreters onto their roster. So I think that Wagner may be going to Chad here soon. That's one of the last dominoes that needs to fall for the success of these military coups in Africa. So if you're following Wagner at all, I would not expect them back in Ukraine anytime soon. I think they're going to be heading towards Africa, and they're already in Niger. They're all over. So just be on the lookout for that. Chad is the next domino.
Yeah, and that actually was the question I kept seeing: is Wagner going to be involved in Niger or somewhere around there?
Almost definitely.
I think so, yeah.
Niger has already asked for Wagner's assistance. So, I mean, I can't imagine that they're not already in country.
Yes, or preparing to go. So a lot of people are asking because, yes, there's still censorship. I'm seeing people complaining about Twitter or X now. They're still having problems there. So we have to create alternative platforms where our videos and all of our other content can be found. Scott, where can people find and follow all the different places you can find and follow your work?
Yeah, so I have my YouTube page, but obviously we know how that goes. That can all go away anytime, any day. If that ends up going away, the best place you can find me is Telegram. That's probably going to be the most reliable place. I don't think I'll ever get kicked off of Telegram. So go follow me on my Telegram. It's Kalibrated, just like my YouTube page. Or you can go find me on Twitter. I spend a lot of time on Twitter. That one is more... on my Telegram, I'm a little bit more analytical. On my Twitter, I tend to argue a little bit more and have a little bit more fun. So, that's what's going on. Oh, actually, this is I just saw a question that we can talk about before we go.
Sure.
Real quick, because I don't think anybody really understands the significance of the ruble dropping, becoming weaker against the US dollar or the euro. And I think this is an important thing to understand. First off, the Russians have an export-based market. So when you're dealing with a service-based economy like the U.S., a strong dollar is good. It's good for your people. It's good for, you want the dollar to be strong. For the Russians, the ruble being weak, and I don't know if you know much about this, but you can add in if I mess up anywhere. The being weak is very good for Russian exports. It makes Russian commodities more appealing to the world, and they can outprice a lot of people. Particularly, what I think is going on is that the Russian central bank is weakening the ruble because the Russians backed out of the grain deal. The EU has been on a campaign in South America and Africa trying to create political pressure against Russia because of the increase in price of grain. I mean, it's just going to happen. When you cut off a large supply of grain from the world, mostly it was going to the EU, but now the EU is going to have to buy it from somewhere else. That is going to affect the global market and the price point for grain and wheat. What the Russians are doing now is they're saying, come buy it from us. We're going to give you a great price because the ruble is incredibly weak now. And so you're going to get this grain at a really good price, and then that's buying political favor to keep the pressure down from these third world countries that are going to be struggling with food security here soon. And what it's going to do is it's going to further turn countries away from the EU, who are making threats rather than trying to assist these nations. And the EU is going to be the big loser here because their food inflation is going to go through the roof. I don't think people understand how dependent the EU was on the grain deal. They were significantly intertwined. So if you're in Europe, get ready for your food prices to start increasing. It's going to get rough.
Okay, so number one, I want to agree with you. Countries that do a lot of export, they will deliberately weaken their currencies, specifically for the reasons you said. Thailand is another example of a country that will deliberately weaken their currency. So if people they don't like Thailand and they see the Thai baht is going down, well, I mean, for Thailand, that is actually very good for them. They're not upset about that.
Yeah.
Also, in Europe, because of the sanctions on Russia and how they've backfired, the Europeans, their governments, they have been trying to paper over the impact that this is all going to have. There's subsidies in Germany, for example. People are saying, well, I haven't seen the energy prices go up at all. It's because they're subsidizing it. And as soon as that becomes unsustainable, you will see a price increase. It is more expensive now, without a doubt. And it's not ever going to go back to being cheap the way that it was. So this is an unsolvable problem, I would say, for Europe. And it's just going to get worse. And their ability to paper over it is going to diminish over time. Would you say that that's accurate, Scott?
Yeah.
I mean, neither one of us are economists. I'm not.
Yeah, no, neither one of us are economists. So obviously, grain of salt, do your own research. But the other key thing you need to look at is there's a lot of propaganda around, the ruble's at 100. it's 1 penny to a dollar basically. First off, the Russians are not trading rubles for dollars. They're not trading rubles for euros. So that's not really a big deal. And the other thing you have to look at is the domestic situation in Russia. Is inflation increasing? No. Is anybody in Russia complaining about food prices, oil prices, anything? How far their dollar is going? Their ruble. No. So it's really just a number on a graph that has to do with Russian export market. And if it continues to get worse, obviously there's a point where you need it to stop. You can't have a completely depreciated ruble, but this is definitely the work of the Russian central bank. They are, because if they wanted it to be stronger, even if the situation wasn't good, they would manipulate it to make it look stronger. That's what currencies are. Everybody manipulates them to do what they need them to do. And if you want it to look stronger, you can do that, at least temporarily. And that's not what the Russians are doing. They're slowly dropping it down. It's like 1 or 2 rubles, a day, 5 or 6 a week. And now they've got it to 100 point. And we'll see where it stops. If it keeps going, then it's something to actually watch and pay attention to, because maybe it's out of control, but it's not, it's not falling off a cliff. It's just slowly being taken down.
Yeah. Scott, are you okay on time? Can we do another 15 minutes?
Yeah, I'm good
for questions. Okay, because I was just saying, people have to, whoever you like to follow in terms of geopolitics or anything else, try to find alternative platforms that they're on. I don't know if you're on Rumble yet, Scott, but you should go on Rumble.
Yeah.
And there's a way to link YouTube directly up to Rumble, so it'll automatically upload. That's what I do. Yeah. And I will put all of Scott's links and all of my links in the video description below, so people just check that out. And then after the stream is over, I will pin all of Scott's contacts and everything at the top of the comment section.
Thank you for doing that, by the way.
Thank you for coming on. So how about this? What will be the situation for Zelensky if Russia launches its own offensive and it succeeds? So I think we could expand this question out a little bit and just say, what is the situation for Zelensky? I would say that he's a bit of a puppet, but what happens with him will be very indicative of the overall status of this proxy that is Ukraine.
Yeah. So I'm on the fence about Zelensky. First off, I think this poor guy got put into the absolute worst situation he could possibly be put into. He doesn't have the diplomatic experience to properly, work in this field. He's an actor. It is what it is. I'm not saying he hasn't done well for himself, but he's definitely not the person you want behind the wheel to make things happen. And I think he's in a very precarious situation right now where if he doesn't do exactly what the West wants him to do, he's going to be, ousted in some way, shape, or form. I don't know who replaces him, but right now it seems like he's on board fully with what the West wants, so he's going to stay for as long as he's needed. If the Russians start succeeding, I think that they're going to have to replace him because they can't have no negotiation Zelensky in office. He has said time and time again he's not going to negotiate 1991 borders, so on. So I think that his time, once the Russians start actually succeeding and this Ukraine project really starts failing, is going to be limited. Whether that turns into government in exile or whether that is a regime change, it's on the table still. There's no real telling what's going on behind closed doors, but the Western appetite for Zelensky's bullcrap seems to be fading fast. Like I said, you don't have a person who is particularly well-rounded in the political sphere in power for this position. He is a puppet, so he's doing what he's being told, but he makes mistakes frequently that make a lot of people very unhappy. And you continue to do that long enough, eventually it's going to come back and bite you in the butt.
This is America's problem that they've had for decades and decades. The type of people who are willing to work with the United States lack the sort of human qualities that you actually require to properly run a country. They're proxies for a reason. So this is a problem that constantly pops up. This is another really good question, and this is something we have to really keep an eye on. What is the likelihood of Poland going across the border as Ukraine continues to further fail militarily? And this is the idea, the concept of the US or another proxy that they pick creating a buffer zone in Western Ukraine, at least in Western Ukraine. What is your take on this, Scott?
So, man, it's just such a toss-up. I think it really depends on how the Russians approach the situation. The ball's really in their court. If they continue what I would consider and what the West would consider to show weakness, and I don't really think it's weakness. I mean, it definitely isn't weakness. It's just their approach to the conflict. Then I think that the West will be much more willing to do things like actually intervene in some way to freeze the conflict, create a tripwire in Western Ukraine. I think if the Russians are aggressive, the West will respond to that appropriately. I think if the Russians continue to be passive, the West will get confident in their abilities to continue this conflict for as long as they possibly can. Do I think Poland wants to go into Western Ukraine? No, I don't think that benefits Poland at all. There's nothing there for them other than historical lands. If you're trying to do, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth sort of deal, which, I mean, is possible, I guess, then you might want that territory because it was formerly Poland. But really, they have a lot of ethnic issues with that region. I mean, historically, Ukraine has not been very friendly to the Poles. And the people in Ukraine still have statues of the men that were not very nice to the Polish people. So there's a lot of ifs there, but it's always a possibility. I mean, we saw it in Syria. Who would have thought there would be U.S. troops sitting in Syria right now? I mean, that's pretty crazy to think about, unless there was a regime change and they had a military base there. So anything's possible. I do think the Russians will respond to the Polish pushing in. I think that will be the catalyst for a larger war. I don't think it's a good idea. But if you're trying to save what you can, that might be the way to go about it. And the West has no issue using its allies against its enemies. So Poland will just become the next Ukraine, potentially.
Yes, and you see them doing this military buildup, which seems almost entirely focused on eventually fighting Russia as the next proxy in line. And it's hard to say what Russia will do if there was a buffer zone in Western Ukraine, because a lot of people weren't really sure what Russia would do with the regarding the U.S. presence in Syria. And what Russia has done in actuality is they have been very patient, and they very incrementally make it more and more difficult for the U.S. to remain there. And I think they'll do the exact same thing in Ukraine, unless they just don't even care what happens to Western Ukraine. They're like, you want Western Ukraine, you can have it.
Because
there are really, a lot.
It really doesn't feel like Russia has any interest in that region at all, outside of the idea of capturing the Carpathians and creating a corridor where it's very easily defended. Outside of that, I mean, there's not really anything for them there. There's no resources, there's no economy, there's no common ethnicity. I think what Russia wants more than Western Ukraine is Southern Ukraine. I think that they would happily freeze the conflict, trading Odessa for Lvov any day of the week. So I think Russia's goals are just focused elsewhere. I would just be curious to see how the Russians respond. Do they do nothing? Do they let the Polish come in and do their thing and just say, okay, that's that. No more Ukraine exists, because that's basically what that would mean at that point. Or do they threaten them and actually stop them via threats? Do they actually do something kinetic? Who knows? I don't think that Poland would really have any of the Article 5 NATO security guarantees if they went into Ukraine. I think that's kind of off the table. I don't think the U.S. wants that. And this whole, I think it's so funny that they're saying that this buildup in Poland is due to Wagner being in Belarus. It's just so goofy to me. It's not what it's about at all. Wagner is no threat to Poland unless they go for the gap, but that would be basically an act of war by Russia against NATO. So there's no other way that they would interpret that outside of that. Belarus is a union state of Russia. Belarus is not going to act without the behest of Russia. So I don't think that is necessarily a realistic possibility. And I think that these troop movements are either saber rattling or preparation for something in Western Ukraine. I think that the writing's on the wall now for almost everybody. Even the Western media, who's been so gung-ho, is now saying this is not going good.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. Wagner as an organization is not a threat to the nation state of Poland.
Yeah.
So they're just using that as an excuse. And we see a lot of this with NATO, with the United States. There's a lot of they're fishing for a pretext is what they're doing. So let's see.
That's always what they're doing. That's always what they're doing everywhere. Is they're always trying to set up a pretext for something, always having an option on the table. That's what I always say, is the West is always trying to create chaos because it gives them opportunity. From chaos, the U.S. has always succeeded in creating opportunities for themselves.
Absolutely. And, it goes from Iraq, weapons of mass destruction, to, again, literally the next country over in Syria, chemical weapons, the responsibility to protect, human rights in regards to Libya, and now everything that's going on here in Ukraine. And eventually they'll be doing the same thing, already are in many ways, regarding Taiwan and provoking a war with China. So it's something we have to always keep an eye on, and we have to ceaselessly explain the actual reality behind all of this, because the US is very good at pushing people's buttons emotionally, getting them to ignore basic facts, and dragging everyone along for yet another.
Yeah, I've never understood how the U.S. is so capable at making foreign countries go against their own pragmatic interests. I've never understood willingly. Like, it's not via threats. It's just propaganda and money and manipulation, and they have done it time and time and time again. I mean, the people in Syria, look at how it turned out for the rebels. Awful. Yeah. It was awful. I mean, it was awful for the whole country, but particularly, I mean, that last year of fighting was brutal for the rebels in Syria. And it's going the same way for Ukraine. I mean, it's the same exact thing. Everywhere Victoria Nuland goes, there seems to be a war that follows. So she was in Sudan not long ago. We had the civil war there. Well, civil war. It was kind of a little civil war thing. And then she just made a stop in Niger. So, I mean, expect something there soon too, probably. The kiss of death.
Be on the lookout. And and again, when you see Europe, for example, Ukraine is definitely a proxy. And we saw what they did. They removed anyone from power who would have made decisions, at least basically in the interest of Ukraine and its future. They removed them, expelled them from the country, ran them out, and they put a client regime in power. The European Union as a bureaucracy is a layer that is meant to smother European sovereignty. Yeah. And so these people are the ones who are always going to stop Europe from making decisions that actually benefit them. And that's what the US does everywhere around the globe. So it's not really, people are asking, why are they making these decisions that are destroying their own country? Because they're just, it's a client regime, and they answer to Washington. They don't actually answer to their own people or their own country's interests. So
and she just got a promotion in the State Department, so apparently they like what she's doing. I detest certain people, and she is one of them. I can't stand to listen to them talk. They are the most connected people, and then the way they talk it's like they're uneducated on most topics. It's just so weird to me.
Well, how about this? I'll make this the last question, and I'll ask you this question, because I always wonder this. Do these people, when they talk, is this just propaganda that they're saying, and they know that it's propaganda, and they're trying to convince the public of this, and they actually understand what's really going on and how big their problems actually are regarding, say, the proxy war in Ukraine? Or do you think they actually believe what they're saying?
I think it's 50-50. I think that they actually believe what they're saying, especially from the beginning of the conflict. It seems that they have consistently been on the same page, the same narrative. They talk the same. Eventually things start coming through. You expect this stuff to happen when somebody doesn't believe in what they're saying. So I definitely believe that they at least partially believe in what they're saying. I think that they are saying things because that's what they're supposed to say. And the actual goals are not what their stated goals are, like regime change in Russia. We saw a little bit of that sneak through, but that has never been an actual position of the U.S. government, regime change in Russia, but that's obviously what they were doing. I think it's also ignorance, 50%, because of how corrupt the intelligence community is. The intel that these people are receiving is the same garbage that's posted on pro-Ukrainian Twitter. I mean, literally, they use Oryx for everything, ISW for everything. It's you have propaganda outlets, basically, NGOs and the likes, that are putting out this information that the intelligence community ends up putting in their reports and delivering to these politicians. And what are the politicians supposed to say? The CIA is lying to me? I mean, that's what I would say instantly without even reading what they wrote. But they're not military experts. They're lawyers. They're politicians. It's what they do. They're just this is not their wheelhouse. So when they're in this wheelhouse, they have to listen to people who they think are knowledgeable. And that would be the intelligence community. And the intelligence community is rife with corruption, with lying. Everybody who is in the intelligence community ends up getting jobs at Raytheon, Boeing, after they get out, because they set these companies up for so much success and making money. And that's what they've done through Ukraine. That's what they're going to continue to do. So I believe it's 50-50. I think that they believe some of it. They believe in the idea of it. And then it's corrupted and reinforced by this intelligence that's just not accurate.
Yeah, and I'm always asking this question. Michael Kaufman is someone whose analysis I have followed throughout the entire duration of the special military operation. He's obviously pro-Ukrainian. I think he was originally born in Ukraine. And he is an expert at one of these U.S. government and corporate funded think tanks. Actually, now he's been in at least two of them since this has been going on. And at one point he was saying about, Ukraine has the advantage because NATO can help them reconstitute brigades. Yeah. But when I heard that, I was thinking, you cannot just build a brigade out of thin air. That's impossible. It will never work. And he said this all the way up until the offensive. And now that the offensive has been a complete failure, he's now realizing that, no, you can't build brigades out of thin air. And I maybe he honestly believed that. He just didn't know, because these people are kind of out of touch, and they're surrounded. They're in an environment where all of these bad ideas are constantly reinforced, and you're encouraged not to contest any of these bad ideas. And it's a tropism, and eventually you get failure. And I think that's where we are.
And that's part of it, right? Is in your intelligence community, if you want a strong intelligence community, you want people coming to you and saying, no, this isn't real. This is not what's going on. We need to change this. We need to adapt this. Or this is not what's happening. We need to figure out a way to fix this so what we want to happen actually starts happening. And that's not what happens in the U.S. intelligence community. I imagine that it's the same in MI6 and so on, because it's more of a political infrastructure now, where if you don't do what you're supposed to do and what goes in line with what people want to happen, you will not be promoted. You will be demoted or fired out of positions. You do not get paydays like the other people do. It's like failing to success. Nobody who's actually being a successful intelligence analyst is making it to the top and making it to, Biden's ear or the State Department's ear. because that's not what they want to hear. It's this echo chamber that just degrades and decays, and then you have this, and then everybody is looking around like, oh, well, how did this happen? How did Ukraine offensive not go as well as it should have? It's because nobody was sitting there like me and you going, guys, you cannot just create brigades in 3 months. They're not going to be successful. What is your assumption that the Russians are going to run away? Why are you making this assumption? Is that actually what's going to happen? Are you going to risk this entire counteroffensive on this assumption? There's nobody being a naysayer. Everybody's just saying, yeah. No, the Russians are weak. The Russians are incompetent. They have no leadership. They're degraded, attrited. The Ukrainians are strong. Their morale is high. They're going to do this the same they did in Kherson and Kharkov. And then, I mean, how is a politician supposed to deny something that a military expert in the CIA or in the Pentagon is saying? I mean, you can't do that. You're not going to go against them. They are your resource. And so that's really what's going on, I think. And that's the biggest problem.
Yeah. And, you know, the thing is, you have this conflict that you're fighting. You're fighting this proxy war. It's part of this bigger agenda of encircling and containing Russia and China and maintaining global hegemony. And this is a flawed premise from the very beginning. It's not plausible. It cannot be done. It's unsustainable. So everything that they build on top of that is going to be increasingly shaky. And I think that's where we are, where you do have people that they cannot say anything positive about it. They cannot provide an alternative plan because there is no way to make this work. It's not going to work. So it's they painted themselves into a corner.
Yeah, and the thing about the State Department in particular is they do not have a off-ramp. They never give themselves an off-ramp. They never have a secondary option. There's no plan B. If plan A fails, you double down on plan A. That's how they've always been. It's how they're always going to be until there is a catastrophic collapse. And that I'm hoping that happens in Ukraine. See, as an American, I want America to be better. That's why I disagree with our foreign policy. I don't think it benefits me at all. I don't think it benefits anybody that I live around or anybody in the country. It does not help anybody. The only people it helps are the people in the military industrial complex and politicians. It's the only people who are making profit off of this, and the only people who are benefiting off of this are those few people. It doesn't it doesn't help the U.S. taxpayer. And what I'm really hoping is there's a swift kick in the ass that doesn't cause America to absolutely decay and crumble in on itself, because America is kind of a great place. However you want to put it. I mean, you can.
Plus, you live there.
Yeah. Plus, I live here, and and you know, I pay taxes and stuff, and you know, there's a lot of good people here. The culture is starting to go the wrong way, in my opinion, and stuff like that. But it's not a horrible place to be, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And that's my position: is I don't want the U.S. to get worse, and that's all that's happening through this war in Ukraine. It's all that's going to happen in Syria and Taiwan and so on. So that's my position. That's where I argue from.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that I often say is that the U.S. has a constructive role to play among the nations of the world, rather than this obsession with imposing itself upon all the nations of the world. Yeah. And that is something that we both want to see. And this is something that I think through our work, we're trying to encourage. We're trying to show people what is really going on, so that people have the information to make better decisions, so that we can solve these problems and move forward. So, and
for some people, this is information they've never heard, ever.
Yes.
They have no idea about any of this. They don't know that the U.S. is sending $24 billion extra dollars to Ukraine just this month, basically, is what they're talking about. Like, they're going to be talking about it again in a couple months. That every 2 weeks they send $1 to $2 billion worth of military equipment. I mean, this is a constant drain, and just nobody knows it's even happening. It doesn't make it on the news. We're the only people who talk about it.
Yeah. And beyond that, something like the National Endowment for Democracy, which pays out millions and millions of dollars to almost every country on earth to interfere and meddle in other people's affairs in ways that Americans would never tolerate someone else coming to the U.S. and doing. And I think if more people understood that, and how that is a stepping stone toward these military interventions, people would be very upset. And I think if you ask them, they would say, no, we don't want to do this.
Yeah.
So I hope people make the differentiate. They can tell the difference between the policymakers doing this and the American people who's it's in their name, but it's not something they even are aware of, let alone something that they would approve of.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, we went over an hour and a half. It was great having you on, Scott. We're definitely going to have you back on
Thank you
regularly. So much. Yeah, it's great to do these live Ukraine updates. We both do our own updates, but it's good to do them live and answer some questions from the audience. And everyone, please, again, check the video description below for everywhere you can find and follow Scott and also my own work in case we're the next ones that get deleted off of YouTube.
Yep.
Thank you for tuning in live, like and share, etc. And yes, and until next time, bye for now.